Coming up on this week's episode of Insight Weekly, the intelligence fusion analysts are discussing the potential militarization of the Mediterranean, ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, as well as between the United States and Venezuela, as we take a closer look at the rise and resumption of geopolitical tensions across the globe in a post-COVID-19 world. Keep watching to find out more. Hello and welcome to another episode of Insight Weekly, an intelligence fusion podcast. If you enjoy our videos, please don't forget to like and share, perhaps drop us a comment, let us know what your key takeaways were, or even ask one of the analysts a question. You may just feature in next week's podcast. This week, the team are discussing the rise and resumption of geopolitical tensions across the globe in a post-COVID-19 world. Firstly, this week we're heading over to Viraj, who's giving us an overview of what he's seen in Africa.
So over the past week, the development that really stands out has been in Libya, where forces loyal to the UN-backed government, or the GNA, took control of an airbase in western Libya that until now has been under the control of the LNA, which is based in eastern Libya. This was achieved with considerable Turkish support, in this case through drone strikes. Over the past several weeks, the GNA have gained the upper hand, and through no small part because of Turkish support. This has consolidated Turkey's position in the country and in the region, so there are geopolitical implications too. Now, the major change in regional dynamic and an escalation came late last year with the signing of the maritime agreement between the UN-backed government and Turkey. Now, both countries have signed an agreement establishing new maritime borders. So as part of this agreement, Libya and Turkey will launch joint maritime exploration activities and acquire a position of strength in decisions concerning gas pipelines crossing these sections of the seabed. Now, this has caused tensions to rise with Italy, Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, and Israel. Now, this maritime border cuts right across the section for the proposed East Med gas pipeline, which will link Cyprus and Israel's offshore gas reserves to mainland Greece and Italy. Last week, Turkey applied in Libya for an exploration permit in the Eastern Mediterranean. Whether the East Med pipeline project goes ahead or not, the Eastern Mediterranean is an area where I expect to see a rise in tension, especially after COVID and throughout the year as well.
So do you think this will lead to an increased militarization of the Mediterranean?
Yeah, so early this year, France deployed a warship in the Eastern Med to support Greece's stance with Turkey. I don't think we're close to any type of conflict in the Mediterranean. I think the concern right now is how this could play out in Libya, with foreign backers of the LNA perhaps increasing their support. There are also wider regional tensions that could come into play, which could perhaps shape future tensions. So the kind of Egyptian involvement, that could be contingent on tensions with Ethiopia, for example, over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which Ethiopia planned to begin filling on July of this year. Now, there are fears of a water war between Ethiopia and Egypt, depending on how Ethiopia fill the dam, during the time period. It could cause water and food shortages in Sudan and Egypt. Now, this has caused considerable anger, especially in Egypt, who have threatened to use all means available to protect its interests. Of course, any global economic crisis, brought about by this COVID-19 outbreak could bring its own challenges, for each of these respective countries. So there are a number of considerations that you have to take into account.
Thank you very much, Viraj. And now over to Chris, who's covering Europe for us this week. What are the trends and patterns that you've seen, Chris?
Yeah, so in Europe, I'm going to start by looking at the migrant crisis around the English Channel, where we've seen a recent rise in the number of illegal migrants attempting to cross despite the COVID-19 crisis. And many of these migrants are claiming to have travelled from countries including Iran, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Palestine. And as I'm sure the other analysts would agree, such countries do continue to suffer from conflicts, and consequently, the focus for media continues to be on the COVID-19 pandemic, but with these conflicts occurring, this migration crisis will continue to be a significant issue, both for the French and British governments. And while this issue has been framed slightly in the light of the COVID-19 crisis, particularly with the health risks posed by living in, say, makeshift migrant camps or illegally crossing borders, I think this migrant crisis will become particularly prominent once the Brexit negotiations restart, with political figures such as the Brexit Party leader, Nigel Farage, having already made headlines after visiting Dover and discussing the extent of the migrant crisis. In fact, on Wednesday, Mr. Farage went sailing in the English Channel, filmed a group of, I think it was around 20 illegal migrants in a rib, which he claimed was being escorted by the French Navy into British waters, although this claim has not been verified.
So, Chris, what kind of impact is the migrant crisis actually having on the French government?
Well, it's not entirely clear as to the effect the migrant crisis is having on French politics, although President Macron's government is facing quite significant difficulties domestically. Recently, days and weeks have seen increasing levels of violence targeted towards both political officials and the police, with riots becoming relatively frequent in Parisian suburbs, along with police being attacked, usually by fireworks or rocks. Meanwhile, Macron's La République En Marche party suffered a blow this week after a group of 7 of his MPs defected to form a new party, meaning that now President Macron does not have a majority in the lower house of the French legislature, meaning he now has to rely on the support of 2 smaller parties to back him. So with this in mind, in the migrant crisis, it means his handling of it will be important, otherwise he could face difficulties in the next election.
So, Chris, I've seen quite a lot. China have been quite proactive in supplying COVID-19 equipment and personal protection equipment to medics in Europe. What's the attitude of European countries been towards China in response to this?
Well, obviously, with direct relief and receiving of aid, there's some sort of positive sentiment, but I think it's a bit too soon to tell exactly how attitudes will change, especially with this notion of China potentially having been culpable in the spread of the virus. I think in the UK it'll be interesting to see if and how the government changes its approach, especially after the prominent Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat established the China Research Group, and Tory backbenchers have expressed concerns towards China and Huawei's involvement in the construction of 5G infrastructure. In regards to Europe, however, in fact, it was quite interesting. The most interesting incident that's happened this week was there was a report published by a French newspaper claiming that China has been spying on the European Commission from the Maltese embassy in Brussels. And these claims haven't been verified, but if there's an investigation launched, then it's likely that we will see a political backlash from the EU towards China, and especially when placed in the context of COVID-19, and China's seemingly aggressive response to any investigations launched. And I think a good example of this is with Australia, where we've seen China planting tariffs against Australian goods after the Australians pushed for an inquiry into the spread of the virus.
Thanks, Chris. China is going to be the focus of my section as well, actually. Today I wanted to talk about the South China Sea and surrounding regions and the tensions going on there between the USA, China, and countries in the region itself. So the tensions here have been going on for quite a long time. So really they aren't anything new, but in April and May, we have seen a significant escalation in these tensions, particularly between the USA and China. As a result, countries which have chosen to side with one or the other have obviously become involved with these tensions being played out on their doorstep, so to speak. In April and May, we've seen quite a few naval actions from the US Navy, and these are often carried out under the form of freedom of navigation operations. And we can see on the platform there's quite a few of these going on, particularly in the South China Sea. And these are often in response to Chinese claims that certain areas of the sea or of surrounding areas are parts of Chinese waters. China, in turn, has responded by deploying their own military vessels to areas which are either disputed or claimed by another state. And the point of doing this is that China claims that these areas are Chinese waters, and they're backing up these movements of vessels with rhetoric coming from their own politicians claiming that this is Chinese territory. Also, we can see in the air as well, the USA has been incredibly proactive, particularly around Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. So we've seen US reconnaissance aircraft as well as US combat aircraft carrying out operations, and mostly just reconnaissance and military drills in this region. But regardless, the volume of incidents involving US aircraft carrying out these drills has increased significantly in April and May. And in turn, we've seen a rise in tensions between both China and the USA as both grapple for the advantage in this very, very large theatre.
So, Max, is there any risk of further escalation between these two countries?
There always is some risk, I think, particularly when you've got so much military hardware in such close proximity to each other. So there's always some risk of escalation, whether this be by accident or by misunderstanding of sorts. This is something we've seen throughout history. But right now, I think it seems premature right now to say that there will definitely be some form of escalation into a military confrontation. I think looking at the past in the South China Sea, both sides have been ratcheting up tensions for years now, really. So what we're seeing right now, yes, it is certainly different. We have seen an increase in April and May. I don't think this means it's going to keep going until there is some form of direct clash. These tensions characterize the relationship between the USA and China in the Pacific. So whilst there is some risk of escalation, I don't think it's guaranteed by any means.
Thanks very much, Max. And finally this week, we're going over to Vincent, who is discussing the Americas with us.
Yeah, so this week I'd like to speak about two issues. The first is the USA and Venezuela and the tensions between the two countries. The rhetoric has gone back up between these two countries, especially after May 3rd, when an attempted coup attempt was launched by a private security company called Silvercore from the US. This attempt at an invasion north of Caracas was launched from Colombian territory, and several of the members that took part were killed, and a number were arrested, including 2 Americans. So for the moment, interrogations of these 2 Americans have been televised in Venezuela, likely as means for propaganda and to back Maduro's rhetoric of anti-imperialist and anti-USA. And it's likely that we'll see the Venezuelan government attempt to leverage their capture in further negotiations with the US, maybe to get sanctions lifted. The operation also led to a blowback on Colombia because of these individuals being trained on the border between Colombia and Venezuela in Colombian territory, and because of this operation being launched from Colombian territory. Colombia and the USA have both denied their involvement in the attempt, but to what extent, it's not particularly known. Finally, the tensions between USA and Venezuela right now have also an Iranian component, because since mid-April, there's been a number of flights from Iran to Venezuela in order to bring what they say are parts for refineries as well as personnel to help with Venezuela's crumbling oil and gas infrastructure and the current fuel shortage. We've also now know that there's a number of Iranian oil tankers going to Venezuela. And recently, Iran has warned the US not to intervene or interfere with these oil tankers going to Venezuela. And this week, yesterday on Wednesday, the Venezuelan defense minister also said that Iranian oil tankers would be escorted by the Venezuelan military while in the Venezuelan economic maritime zone. The second point within the region I'd like to make is also the resumption of activity by the ELN. So the ELN had declared a ceasefire in April during the time of COVID-19, but never renewed it once it expired. So since the beginning of May, there's been a number of attacks by the ELN targeting oil and gas infrastructure and the police. The ELN has long been operating between Colombia and Venezuela. And so the current tensions between the two countries, but now built up because of attempted invasion and Venezuela blaming Colombia as part of it, it's likely that the ELN will even have more free reign between the two countries due to a lack of cooperation to try to get rid of the group. Additionally, the resumption of activity by the LN will likely lead to additionally internally displaced persons within Colombia due to fighting, which could also pose a risk in regards to combating COVID-19 in the country.
So, Vincent, in relation to tensions between countries in the region, do you think COVID-19 has played a factor in any disputes between countries?
I wouldn't say it's created significant geopolitical problems to say, but the border closures and travel restrictions that we've seen with certain countries has created some disagreements. So one such example has been in regards to Costa Rica, Panama, and Nicaragua. So Costa Rica has implemented measures to test all truck drivers at the border to come into Costa Rica. Any truck driver that tests positive for COVID-19 or that even just shows symptoms without having to be tested are turned back at the border. Any truck driver that doesn't test positive for COVID-19 can enter, but their trucks will be escorted by police to their final destination. And no truck driver can stay in the country for more than 72 hours. So that's created tension between the three countries with accusations that it's impacting trade and freedom of movement. So we've seen protests on the border between Panama and Costa Rica by truckers against these measures. And we've also seen the president of Nicaragua close 2 border access points between the countries as a means to protest this. One of the protest sayings is that Costa Rica didn't take the measures through the proper regional channels, but Costa Rica says that because of COVID-19, there was no way to hold such meetings to implement such measures.
Thank you very much again to the Intelligence Fusion analysts. Some interesting insight as always there. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you receive new content direct to your inbox. And as well, a quick reminder for our clients that they can actually use the hashtag InsightWeekly within the advanced filtering options on the platform to take a closer look at the incidents we've discussed this week. Until next week, stay safe.